What you are about to hear was never meant to leave the walls of Sandringham. Not the staff, not the family, not even the private secretaries who have sworn lifelong silence. Yet tonight, the truth is breaking free. On a cold January evening, while the rest of Britain slept under a blanket of frost, King Charles III summoned his youngest son to the estate that once belonged to the woman whose name still haunts every corridor of the monarchy, Princess Diana. What happened inside that room was not a father-son conversation. It was an execution of inheritance. Quiet, calculated, final. Harry walked into Sandringham expecting another tense but manageable royal lecture. He left stripped of something he had always believed was untouchable, his share of Diana's fortune. This is the story of the night the King of England secretly cut his own son off from his mother's money, and why those closest to the situation are calling it the most explosive royal confrontation since the divorce papers were signed decades ago. The invitation arrived without warning. No formal letter on heavy cream stationery. No polite request filtered through private secretaries. Just a brief, unsigned message delivered by secure courier. Sandringham. Friday, 8 p.m. alone. Harry was in California when it came. Meghan was filming. The children were asleep. According to sources close to the Sussex household, Harry stared at the message for a long time before he finally answered with 2 words. I'll be there. He flew commercial under a false name. No entourage. No security detail beyond the bare minimum. When the car turned through the famous gates of Sandringham, the estate was already dark. Only a handful of windows glowed. One of them belonged to the king's private study. Charles was waiting. The king did not rise when his son entered. He remained seated behind the same mahogany desk where his own father had once signed documents that shaped the modern monarchy. On the desk sat a single folder. Thick, bound in black. No royal crest. No official seal. Just Harry's name written in Charles's unmistakable handwriting. Sit down, the king said. His voice was quieter than usual. That was the first warning sign. Harry Saturday. What followed was not the emotional confrontation the public might imagine. There were no raised voices at first. No accusations about podcasts or Netflix deals or the Oprah interview. Charles opened the folder and began to speak in the measured, almost clinical tone of a man who had already made every decision long before the meeting began. Diana's fortune, he explained, had never been as simple as the public believed. Yes, the Princess of Wales left a substantial estate. Yes, the bulk of it was placed in trust for her 2 sons. But the structure of that trust, the fine print, the conditions, the silent clauses that only a handful of lawyers and the monarch himself fully understood, had always contained a mechanism that most people never knew existed. A mechanism that allowed the sovereign, under certain circumstances, to review and, if necessary, redirect the flow of funds. Charles told Harry that those circumstances had now been met. The king cited a series of actions he described as irreconcilable with the intentions of the trust. He spoke of public statements that, in his view, had repeatedly and deliberately damaged the institution Diana had once served. He spoke of commercial ventures that, according to palace legal advice, risked turning the late princess's name into a brand rather than a legacy. He spoke of security arrangements, of citizenship questions, of the quiet withdrawal of certain protective measures that had once been taken for granted. And then he delivered the sentence that, according to those briefed on the meeting, caused the temperature in the room to drop. As of this evening, Charles said, your access to the discretionary portions of your mother's estate is suspended. Indefinitely. Harry did not speak for several seconds. When he finally found his voice, it was low and tight. He asked whether this was about the money or about control. Charles answered that it was about both, and about something larger. The king said he would not allow Diana's inheritance to become a weapon in an ongoing war against the crown. Harry pushed back. He reminded his father that Diana had left the money to her sons, not to the institution. He reminded him that William had received his share without restriction. He asked, pointedly, whether the same standard would ever be applied to the heir. Charles did not raise his voice. He simply closed the folder. William, he said, has never forced me to choose between the monarchy and my children. You have. The meeting lasted 4 to 7 minutes. When it ended, Harry stood. He did not shake his father's hand. He did not offer the traditional bow. He simply looked at the man who had once been his closest ally in the years after Diana's death and said, according to one account that has begun to circulate among a very small circle of confidants, she would never have allowed this. Charles's reply was almost gentle. She is not here. I am. Harry left Sandringham that night without speaking to anyone else on the estate. The car that had brought him was already waiting. By the time he reached the airport, the first encrypted messages were already moving between California and a handful of legal offices in London. What the public does not yet know is that the cut was not limited to a simple freeze on bank transfers. The mechanism Charles activated reaches deeper. Certain properties that had been held in secondary trusts. Certain investments that generated annual income. Certain personal items of Diana's that had never been publicly inventoried. Letters, jewelry, even the original drafts of speeches she never delivered, were quietly reassigned under new protective arrangements controlled by the sovereign's private office. In practical terms, Harry's financial independence from the residual wealth of his mother was severed in a single evening. Those close to the Sussexes say the shock was profound. For years, the understanding inside the family had been that Diana's money was the one thing the institution could never touch. It was a final firewall between Harry and complete royal dependency. That firewall is now gone. The timing was not accidental. The meeting took place only days after a series of private legal reviews ordered by the king himself. Reviews that examined every public statement Harry and Meghan had made about the royal family since 2020. Reviews that assessed the commercial use of Diana's image and name in various projects. Reviews that, according to one senior source, concluded the trust's original protective purpose was being undermined. Charles did not act alone. The decision was discussed quietly with a small group of advisors who have spent decades managing the intersection of royal wealth and public perception. William was informed after the fact. His response, according to those familiar with the conversation, was measured but not surprised. The wider family has been told almost nothing, and that is why this story has remained underground for as long as it has. The palace has no interest in confirming it. The Sussexes have every reason to keep the details private while their lawyers examine every available option. Yet the silence is beginning to crack. Staff who were present at Sandringham that night have started to speak, carefully, anonymously, and only to people they trust. The picture they paint is consistent. The king was calm. Harry was devastated. And the document that changed everything remained on the desk long after the younger prince had left the room. What happens next is already in motion. Legal teams on both sides are preparing positions. Questions of jurisdiction, of trust law, of the residual powers of the crown are being examined in extreme detail. There is talk of challenge. There is talk of public disclosure. There is also talk, more quietly, that Harry may have already begun exploring ways to rebuild the financial independence his mother's fortune once guaranteed. But the deeper wound is not financial. It is the knowledge that the man who once walked behind Diana's coffin as a boy has now used the full weight of the monarchy to close the final door she left open for him. King Charles has drawn a line, and on the other side of that line stands his son, cut off from the fortune of the mother they both lost, in a room that still carries a memory in every shadow. The public has not yet been told the full truth, but the truth is already moving, and when it finally surfaces, the royal family will never look the same again. Host leans closer to the camera. Voice drops. Stay with me, because what happened after Harry left Sandringham that night, the phone calls, the late-night meetings in California, the quiet instructions issued from Buckingham Palace, reveals just how far this confrontation is prepared to go. The story is only beginning. Harry's plane had not even left British airspace when the first call reached Montecito. Meghan answered on the second ring. According to people familiar with the conversation, Harry's voice was flat, almost detached, as he repeated the words his father had used. Suspended. Indefinitely. Discretionary portions. The mechanism. By the time he finished, the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that staff in the house later said they could hear the ocean through the open window. Within the hour, the Sussex legal team was activated. Not the usual public relations circle. The private counsel. The ones who deal with trust, residual powers of the crown, and the quiet corners of English law that most people never see. Secure video links were open between California and London. Documents that had not been reviewed in years were pulled from encrypted archives. Diana's original will. The supplementary instruments. The letters of wishes that had never been made public. Every clause was placed under a microscope before dawn broke on the west coast. What they found confirmed the king's claim. Buried deep inside the structure that protected Diana's estate was a narrow but real power review vested in the sovereign. It had been designed, decades earlier, as a safeguard against any future attempt to exploit the princess's name or fortune in ways that could damage the institution she had once served. Charles had simply decided the safeguard now applied to his own son. In Buckingham Palace, the machinery moved with equal speed and far less emotion. By morning, the private office had issued internal instructions. Certain standing payments linked to secondary trusts were paused. Access credentials to investment accounts that had previously generated quiet annual income for Harry were revoked. A small number of personal effects once associated with Diana, items that had never appeared on any public inventory, were reclassified under new protective arrangements controlled directly by the king's household. None of this was announced. None of it needed to be. The effect was immediate. William was briefed the same day. The meeting took place in a private sitting room at Windsor. Those familiar with the exchange say the Prince of Wales listened without interruption. When Charles finished, William asked only one question: whether the decision was reversible. The king's answer was measured. "Everything is reversible," he said, "if the circumstances change." The implication was clear. The circumstances, in Charles's view, had not. Harry's response was not the public explosion many expected. There was no late-night statement, no carefully worded Instagram post. Instead, the Sussexes went silent on the subject while their lawyers began the slow, methodical work of testing every available avenue. Jurisdiction questions, arguments about the original intent of the trust, challenges based on the claim that the power of review had been stretched beyond its intended purpose. At the same time, quieter conversations began about how to rebuild financial independence without any residual reliance on the late princess's estate. Commercial projects already in development were accelerated. New partnerships were explored. The message inside the household was consistent. They would not be left exposed. Yet the emotional damage ran deeper than any balance sheet. Friends who spoke to Harry in the days that followed described a man who kept returning to the same point. This was not simply about money. It was about the final thread that had still connected him to his mother in a tangible way. The fortune had always been more than currency. It was the last independent piece of Diana that the institution could not fully claim. Now that piece had been taken by the very man who once walked behind her coffin. Inside the wider royal household, the reaction was more complex. Some senior figures privately welcomed the decisive action, arguing that the constant drip of public criticism had left the king with little choice. Others worried about the long-term optics. Cutting a son off from his mother's inheritance, even through legal mechanisms that had always existed, risked looking cold. The palace's communications team prepared multiple contingency lines in case the story surfaced. None of them have been used. The preference remains absolute silence. That silence is becoming harder to maintain. Over the past weeks, fragments have begun to move through a very small network of former staff, trusted journalists, and legal circles on both sides of the Atlantic. The details remain incomplete, but the core of the story is consistent. A closed-door meeting at Sandringham, a black folder, a suspension of access, and a father who told his son that Diana was no longer there to protect him. What happens next will determine whether this remains a private rupture or becomes a public fracture. Harry's legal team is understood to be examining every option short of open court. A full public challenge would force a disclosure of documents the monarchy has kept sealed for decades. The palace knows this. Charles knows this. The calculation on both sides is the same. Whoever escalates first risks losing control of the narrative. In the meantime, the practical consequences continue. Income streams that once arrived without comment have stopped. Certain properties that had been held in secondary arrangements are no longer available. The quiet financial cushion that had always existed as a final safety net is gone. And still the public has not been told. That is about to change. Because the people who were in the room that night, or who received the first calls afterward, are no longer prepared to carry the secret indefinitely. Some believe the truth should come out for the sake of transparency. Others simply believe the story is too large to remain buried. Either way, the pressure is building. King Charles made a choice in that study at Sandringham. He chose the institution over the residual claim of his younger son. He chose finality over reconciliation. He chose to close the last door Diana left open. Harry left that night with nothing more than the clothes he was wearing and the knowledge that the fortune his mother had intended for him had been placed beyond his reach by the man who now wears the crown. The full consequences of that decision are still unfolding. The phone calls continue. The legal files grow thicker. The distance between father and son, already vast, has become something colder and more permanent. And somewhere in the archives of the royal household, the black folder that changed everything still sits on a shelf, waiting for the day its contents are no longer secret. This is not the end of the story. It is the moment the story became irreversible. If this is the first time you are hearing these details, you now understand why the silence from both sides has been so absolute. The stakes are no longer just personal. They are institutional. And the next move, whoever makes it, will decide whether the House of Windsor can survive another public reckoning with the legacy of the woman whose death once nearly destroyed it. The meeting at Sandringham was only the beginning. What comes next will be fought in private rooms, in encrypted messages, and eventually, inevitably, in the court of public opinion. Stay tuned. The full truth is still emerging, and when it does, the monarchy will have nowhere left to hide.